Hi there, this is your favorite host San with another Python tutorial for beginners. In this video, we will learn about input function in Python in details along with few use cases. As we begin to design our programs, we soon come to realize that we need our programs to be dynamic in the sense that it needs to ask user for inputs. Interactive programs not only give output to the user but also can take inputs from the user into the program. For example, user typically needs to provide a lot of user inputs when playing video games or when using database applications, web applications, or any applications that interact with the user, such as a simple calculator or a calendar application. If we are to develop an interactive program, we need to know how to write script that lets the program read input from the user at runtime. And that's exactly what we are going to learn in this video. If you are new to my channel, please consider subscribing and also hit that bell button to get timely notifications on new contents like this. So let's learn about how to provide user input in Python programs. Python's built-in function input, that's the syntax for the input function, and this is used to get user input using a keyboard. Python stops executing the rest of the program when input function is executed and continues when the user has given some input using enter key on the keyboard. The input function then reads a line from the console, converts it into a string, and returns it. Let's see an example. Let's say age equals user input would be prompted here. We can run this and you see the execution has not stopped. We can force it to stop, but right now what is happening is it is asking the user to enter something. And as soon as I enter the user input on the keyboard and press enter, the program finishes with exit code 0. Now, as you see, there's nothing prompted to the user and nothing is really happening on the output when the user presses enter because that's all the program is set to do. The input function also accepts an optional string argument which prompts a message to the user. This way, when a program is executed, there's no output to the user. The execution is paused, and if we have to stop, we have to force to stop the execution because it's asking user to enter age, although it doesn't prompt anything to the user. And when the user hits the enter, there's no other output to the user. And this is the very minimal usage of input function. Input function also accepts an optional string argument that is used to prompt a message to the user. This way, when the program is executed, the user knows that the program is waiting for the user to enter some input. And the prompt message tells the user exactly what data the program is asking to input. So in this previous example, let's say we want to prompt to the user to enter your age. And then after the user enters a number and hits the enter, we want the program to print the output to the user. So in this case, let's say the output would be your current age is a string and the age that the user entered. Now, as you saw when we run this time, it is prompting the user that it is looking for age, and when the user enters, hit the enter key. Now this is giving output back to the user on what the entered age was. When using input function, when a user presses enter key, input function reads a line from the console, returns to the program, and continues executing next line of code. As a programmer, every time we are using input function, we have to be mindful of two things. First, the input function takes the information that the user entered, in this case 234, and returns it into the string format, even if the input was a numerical value, such as in this example. We cannot add entered value of age to an integer. So let's say if we wanted to do another example here, saying in 10 years how old you will be. So let's say print in 10 years you will be, let's say age, we wanted to add 8 to 10 and say years old. So if we're to do something like this, and when the user enters age, let's say 32 years old, and press enter, it would give out an error because here we are trying to add a string data type to an integer data type. The type error basically says we can only concatenate string to string, but age plus 10, it's basically string with integer trying to be concatenated. So there's a type error. In another example, instead of comma, let's say we can also do plus age, or remove it, and let's run this again. Age is 34, it would still give out same output with the plus age, but we're not doing addition here. We are just concatenating this string with the age string rather than an addition operation. But if we intend to do arithmetic operations, we will have to first cast the user input into integer format or a floating point number or other suitable data type before such statements. For example, if we were to do something like this without error, we would have to pass that age as an integer value and then use that with addition plus 10 years old. Try it again. 35 years old. Now it is showing me my current age is 35 and in 10 years you will be 45 years old. Not doing this type conversion to reformat a string is one of the main reasons programmers run into issues later in the development phase. Second thing that we have to be mindful is that the input that the user provides can be empty or indifferent or undesirable format or values. In our example program that asks user for their age, we can't simply assume that the user will enter a positive value. User could mistakenly or deliberately provide a negative value, and our code can then have a butterfly effect or chaotic result. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So when we entered positive value, there's no error, there's no issue at all. The current age is shown, and then in 10 years, how old you will be shown. Let's run that again, and instead of positive value, enter a negative value. The program still runs without error, but there's an issue here as the current age is negative value. The user entered undesirable value here that the developer didn't envision, and what happened is that negative value is received and the current age is stored as a negative value. Well, we know age cannot be a negative value, so there's an issue with how the program was developed here. So we need to implement some kind of logic to avoid these kind of scenarios. For example, if we want to take care of potential negative value entered for age, we could implement conditional statement with a while loop to take care of this problem. So in this case, this would be my input, and I would put that under a while loop. A while not done, I would keep asking that, and what is done? So let's define done as a false value, and let's also define age to be default at 0. And while not done, we would keep asking age to the user, and then here we need conditional logic saying if age is more than or equal to 0, then we do something, and what we do is print this statement. Your current age is that value, and we need to change this to a float because age by default is a string after this input statement. So convert that to float, and then we do this comparison operation. If it is a positive number or 0, then we print the current age. We change done back to true so that the while loop ends. But what happens if float age is less than 0, we will print output saying print age cannot be a negative value. Please try again. And that would be our message to the user. We can get rid of this and see how this code works. Enter your age. So let's say we entered 9. Current age is 9, which works fine. Run it again and enter a negative value, and it correctly shows it cannot be a negative value. Please try again, and we try again. We enter a positive value, and the program ends again. So as you saw, this example will take care of potential negative values entered for age. However, it won't be enough, as user can still enter empty value, like in this case, and we run into other issues. Again, when we run this, user can enter a string, and then we also run into other issues. So empty value or any non-numerical value, and the program won't work. So we need to further tweak the program to take care of those scenarios into considerations. We won't go over all these scenarios in this video. We will discuss Python exception handling for this purpose in a separate video. The intent here is to show, and hopefully you got the idea, that in real life applications, if we fail to limit what the user can input, user will enter whatever they want, sometimes even malicious code, and this can create serious problems when executing the rest of the code. So it is something that we need to be careful of when taking user inputs. Next thing I want to talk about is a way to take or accept floating point number or integer number as input from user instead of casting user input every time we need to access it. For example, in this case, every time we are using a if statement or conditional statement, we are converting age to as a floating number and then using this conditional operator. But there's another way to do it, and when we accept input here, we can say float input, and what that does is as soon as user enter the age and hit the enter key, the input that the user provide would be stored as a floating point number in the variable age. Here we can get rid of float age and here as well. So we don't have to do the casting every time we're using if statement, because here we are forcing the input to be stored as a floating point number. And here we can do plus age. And now when we run this, enter your age, we enter, let's say 34 years, and it will give the correct output as a floating value. Now, obviously, this would still give error when non-numerical value is entered. For example, when we run this again, it asks for age to the user, and we are giving non-numerical value, let's say a string, it would also give out error like in the previous case. Another thing I want to talk about is how we can get multiple inputs from a user in one line. In Python, it is possible to get multiple values from user in one line. We can accept 2 or 3 values from the user. For example, in a single execution of the input function, we can ask the user multiple numbers and store it in different variables. Let's see how this can be done. So I want to get rid of all of these and say I want to get 3 numbers, num1, num2, and that would be input from the user. Enter 3 numbers, and user would need to separate them by space. Let's say space. And when we get the input, we would have to use the split function to split them into different numbers. And that way, when the user enters 3 different numbers separated by space, they would be stored in num1, num2, and num3. Let's print the sum. In this case, we would have to add num1 plus num2 plus num3. Now, this is not going to give us the desired outcome, and you will soon see why. Let's just try this and run this. So it's asking for 3 different numbers separated by space. Let's say 1, 2, and 3 are my numbers. When you hit enter, it would add all those numbers. But in this case, the addition is a concatenation because we are not casting numbers to be integer, but by default it's stored as a string. So all 3 strings are concatenated, and the output is 1, 2, 3. So we need to have integer or float here and convert all of them into integer numbers. And run it again, see the outcome, 1, 2, and 3, it would give us 6. Suppose we don't know how many numbers the user wants to enter. For example, in this case, program asks to enter 3 numbers, but what if the user wants to add more than 3 numbers at the same time? And the program should work no matter values the user enters separated by space. How can we tweak the code to adapt to unknown number of inputs? We want to be able to take different values or different number of inputs. So let's say entered numbers equals input, and instead of 3 numbers, let's say few numbers separated by space, and we would still use that split function to split all those inputs. Now in this case, we have this list here, and we want to use that, but we would have to cast that as float or integer. Instead of just casting, I want to show you how we can use map function to convert all of them into integer or float type. Map would take 2 inputs. Let's say the first input is float, and second input would be entered numbers. Let's say nums. Bracket close here, and after the map function I want to change everything to a list, and we still haven't added all the numbers, so a sum function here at the end. I'll explain in a bit what each of those functions are doing. Enter a few numbers separated by space. Let's say I want to enter 1, 2, and 3 like in a previous example, and see how that runs. It's giving us 6.0 floating number because with the map function we were converting that floating values. Let's enter more than 3 numbers. So 34, 43, that would give us 77, and then 23. And when we hit enter, it would give us 100. So I think the code is working fine. Now let's explain what's happening here. So as in the previous example, the input function returns a string containing numbers separated by space. The split function again returns a list of strings on the spaces. Now we are using map function, and what it does is it performs floating conversion operation on all the elements of this list and returns a map object. The list function then converts the map object back into a list, which is then added using the sum function. I hope you got the idea on how this is working. Next example I want to cover in this video is how we can accept multi-line input from a user. In the example code above, the user is asked to separate numbers by spaces. What if the user accidentally hits enter while trying to enter space rather than the enter on the keyboard? Well, the program will end with the sum of whatever the user has entered before hitting the enter key. That happened because the input function returns when it encounters a new line character. In an alternate scenario, if we intend to send multi-line information using input function, by default the function will only return the first line and the function will end. Therefore, to take care of multi-line inputs, we need to reuse the input function using a while loop. Let's see an example. Let's say I want to take all inputs and I want to store that in an empty list. Let's assume that we are asking the user to enter all the users that are attending a function. So attending users. But it's not asking for user input yet. That would go into a while loop. Now we want to say new user equals. So inside a while loop, it is repeatedly asking what the new user's information is. And if new user is a valid name or anything other than empty string, we want to add that user into this empty list. So we can do that with all inputs dot append function. And what we want to append is the new user. And if the new user is not entered or blank space is entered, user basically just hit enter without entering any name, then we want to break out of that while loop. And after coming out of the while loop, I want to print attending users, all inputs. So attending user, Tyler, enter, and Tim, enter, Tom, enter. Now in this, I want to enter a blank line to exit out of the while loop, and it should print out all the names after I do that. And there we go. Attending users are Tyler, Tim, and Tom in the list, because we are first defining all inputs as empty list, and then after every iteration of while loop is either appending that new name. If the new name is entered into list all user input, blank line is entered, then it will exit out of the while loop. So that was a quick example on how we can enter multi-line inputs using a while loop. That is all for this video. In this video, we learned about the input function, how to use it to get single input, multiple inputs, as well as multi-line inputs. We also learned how to avoid potential error with usage of input function. Hope this was helpful in understanding Python framework for getting keyboard inputs. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.